The forest is alive with noise. Machine guns chatter in short, angry bursts. Mortars thump in the distance. Somewhere out there, artillery shells crack the night sky open with orange flashes that glow between the trees. It's cold, wet, and dark. Hürtgen Forest, late 1944. In a shallow foxhole scraped into the muddy earth, two American GIs huddle shoulder to shoulder. Their world is no bigger than the rim of their hole and the patch of shattered trees in front of them. Rain drips from branches. Roots jut out like broken bones. Every so often, a German flare floats up and turns the world white for a few seconds, then drops away and leaves everything darker than before. Both men clutch the same lifeline, an M1 Garand. The rifle is heavy in their hands, slick with rain and sweat. The woodstock is scarred from weeks of fighting. The metal is cold enough to bite bare skin. Inside each rifle, 8 rounds of .3006 stacked inside a small U-shaped piece of steel. An N-block clip. "Keep your head down," the older GI mutters, breath steaming in the thin air. His name is Miller. He's been in this forest long enough to grow a permanent squint. The younger one, Parker, is new enough to still flinch at every nearby shot. A burst of German fire rips through the trees, tracers carving red lines through the mist. Splinters rain down on the foxhole. Both men duck, pressing closer to the mud, hearts racing. "Jesus," Parker whispers. "They're close." "Closer than I like," Miller answers. "Watch that gap." He nods toward a jagged opening between two blown-out pines. "They'll try to come through there." Parker swallows. His fingers are numb, but he tightens them on the rifle anyway. He knows his M1. He's cleaned it 100 times, practiced loading it in the dark, learned to avoid slamming his thumb in the bolt. He trusts it. Mostly. What he doesn't trust is the sound. He's heard the stories in every camp and foxhole from England to here. Stories passed down from guys who swear they heard it, or knew a guy who knew a guy. When your Garand runs dry, it makes a sound. A bright little ping, and the Germans, they say, listen for it. A sound that means, this American is empty, this one's out of ammo, this one's about to reload. Get him now. It's just a little noise. But in the dark, in the cold, with men trying to kill you, it feels huge. Another flare goes up. For a heartbeat, the forest turns to daylight in washed-out green and gray. Parker sees movement, shadows slipping between trees, low and fast. "Contact," he hisses. 3 o'clock. "See him," Miller says. The flare dies, the darkness slams back down, and suddenly all they have is instinct and muzzle flashes. Miller pops up first. He raises his M1, sights on the flicker of movement, and squeezes the trigger. The rifle bucks against his shoulder, barking a deep, powerful shot. A shape staggers and drops behind a stump. Parker rises beside him. The buttstock is snug in his shoulder. He doesn't think, he just fires. The recoil punches straight back, the gas system cycles, the bolt slams forward, and the rifle is ready again. Bang, bang, bang. The forest around them is a strobe of light and shadow. More Germans are moving in the trees. The air fills with the whip-crack of bullets and the high, panicked shouts of men in 2 different languages. Parker fires again and again. He feels the rifle moving with him, working with him. No bolt handle to work, no pause between shots. Just trigger, recoil, trigger, recoil. He's dimly aware that the Garand is doing exactly what it was built to do. Throw a lot of accurate fire downrange, fast. Then it happens. He pulls the trigger. Click. No shot. Just the empty, hollow click of a hammer falling on nothing. And in the same heartbeat, just inches from his face, a sound he's been dreading since boot camp. Ping! The empty clip springs free from the rifle's guts and flips into the night, bouncing off the edge of the foxhole with a tiny sparkle of metal on rock. Parker freezes for a fraction of a second. There it is, he thinks. They heard it. They know. I'm empty. Move, Miller barks. The spell breaks. Parker drops back into the hole as a burst of German fire rips overhead, splintering the log they were using as a firing step. He stares at his rifle. The bolt is locked open, the chamber yawning, the magazine waiting. His fingers move almost on their own. Down into the ammo pouch. Find the hard edge of a fresh clip. 8 rounds of .30-06 gleaming dully in the dark. He slams it into the receiver. There's a solid click as it seats. His hand snaps up and out of the way just in time as the bolt slams forward with a metallic chunk, stripping the top round into the chamber. The rifle is alive again. The whole thing takes maybe a second. "Up!" Miller shouts. Parker rises, plants his boots against the muddy wall, and brings the M1 back up, just as more figures dart between the trees. His fear of the ping is gone, burned away in the rush to reload. All that matters now is that the rifle in his hands is full again. He fires. The narrator's voice cuts in over the chaos, steady and clear. American GIs cursed the M1 Garand's ping. In foxholes and barracks, they swore it would get them killed. They told each other stories about Germans listening for that little metallic note, waiting for their chance. But in the real noise of war, guns, mortars, screams, splintering wood, that ping meant something else. It meant the rifle had done its job, 8 rounds gone, time to feed it again. And no matter what the myths say, that tiny sound was usually heard by only one man, the one about to slam a fresh clip home, and keep fighting. Before the ping ever echoed through a foxhole in Europe or a jungle ravine in the Pacific, it was just the byproduct of an idea on a drawing board in peacetime America. The idea was simple and radical for its time. What if every American infantryman had a rifle that didn't need to be worked by hand between shots? For decades, armies had lived with bolt-action rifles. You fired. You lifted the bolt. You pulled it back, pushed it forward, locked it down. Then you fired again. It worked. It was accurate, but it was slow. In the chaos of World War I, officers and engineers saw what modern firepower looked like. Machine guns that could hold whole battalions in the dirt, and close-range fights where the man who shot first and fastest usually lived. When the war ended, forward-thinking militaries started asking the same question. Could the individual soldier carry something better? In the United States, the search for a semi-automatic service rifle became a long, technical obsession. Designers submitted endless prototypes. Some were gas-operated, some recoil-operated, some clever, some ridiculous. Ordnance boards tested them, broke them, and argued over every detail. Into this maze stepped a quiet, methodical engineer at the Springfield Armory, John C. Garand. He wasn't a general. He wasn't a flashy salesman. He was a problem solver. Over years of development, he refined a gas-operated rifle that could do something remarkable, harness the energy of each shot to eject the spent case, cock the action, and chamber a new round automatically. You pulled the trigger. The rifle did the rest, until it ran dry. By 1936, after endless tests and revisions, the U.S. Army officially adopted his design. The new standard service rifle would be known simply as the U.S. Rifle, caliber .30 M1. The rest of the world would come to know it as the M1 Garand. The heart of the M1's mystery for many GIs wasn't the gas system or the sights, it was the thing that fed it. Instead of a detachable box magazine, the M1 used something different, a small U-shaped piece of stamped steel called an en-bloc clip. It held 8 rounds of 30-06 ammunition, stacked in 2 columns. You didn't load the magazine first and then insert it. You loaded the clip and the ammo into the rifle as a single unit. This wasn't an accident or a shortcut. American ordnance officers were deeply suspicious of detachable magazines for general-issue rifles. They worried troops would lose them, dent them, or simply not have enough. A lost mag could turn a rifle into a clumsy single shot in the middle of a battle. Clips, on the other hand, were cheap, rugged, and expendable, so Garand's rifle was built around an internal magazine that held 8 rounds. The en-bloc clip was just the skeleton that kept those rounds aligned. To load, a soldier would pull the bolt back and lock it open, place the full clip, rounds and all, into the open receiver from the top, press it down until it's seated with a solid click. Let the bolt fly forward, stripping the top round into the chamber. From that moment, the rifle would fire 1 shot per trigger pull. No manual cycling, no bolts to work, just 8 fast, powerful shots. Then came the clever part. When the last round was fired, the rifle's mechanism did something unique. The follower that pushed the rounds up would rise to its highest point, tripping a catch. The bolt locked back, ready for a new clip, and the empty clip. It was kicked clear of the rifle's guts and launched out the top. Metal on metal, clip on receiver. A little piece of steel bouncing free, hitting the ground, or a helmet, or the edge of a foxhole. Ping. In a quiet firing range, it was sharp and unmistakable. A neat audio punctuation mark at the end of every 8-shot string. On a battlefield, it was one more tiny sound in a hurricane of noise. From the moment soldiers began training seriously with the M1, the clip defined their relationship with the rifle. Recruits learned to feel the rhythm. Rifle loaded. 8 shots. 8. Last round fired. Ping. Bolt locked back. New clip in. Back in the fight. Drill sergeants timed them. They shouted at anyone who fumbled the reload, mocked those who got M1 thumb by letting the bolt slam on their hand, and made the ping synonymous with, "You're empty, move faster." On tidy American ranges, the ping wasn't a life or death concern. It was a training tool. Out there in the future, on muddy hills in Italy and in foxholes in Belgium, soldiers would remember that training. They'd carry it with them along with their rifles and clips and rumors always follow something unusual. Most other rifles of the era didn't make that same little sound. A Mauser or a motion nagant was fed from loose rounds or from a thin stripper clip that snapped into place and came away in the same motion. There was no distinctive noise that said, "This rifle is empty now." The M1's ping was different. It felt personal. It felt like a confession. By the time America entered World War II in 1941, the M1 was just becoming truly widespread in frontline units. The United States was the only major power to issue a semi-automatic rifle as its standard infantry weapon. On paper, that was a clear advantage in firepower, but inside barracks, on troop ships, and around campfires in England and North Africa, the conversation wasn't always about doctrine or ballistics. It was also about the little details, the nicknames, quirks, and superstitions that soldiers attached to their tools. And one of those details was a question that nagged at a lot of young riflemen. If I can hear that ping when my rifle is empty, can the enemy hear it too? That fear would travel into every theater of the war, into deserts, mountains, jungles, and dark German forests, where the M1's true story and the truth behind its most famous sound would be written shot by shot. The story of the M1 Garand's ping moves with the rifle itself, out of American armories, across oceans, and into some of the fiercest battlefields of the 20th century. When the US adopted the M1 in 1936, the world was already sliding toward another war. At first, the rifle's rollout was slow and bureaucratic. Old Springfield bolt action still filled racks in armories and National Guard units. New M1s trickled out of Springfield Armory, then later from additional production lines, to regular Army units and the Marines. On stateside ranges, recruits learned to shoot the rifle before they had any real notion of what it would mean in combat. They learned the manual of arms, how to snap a full clip into place with the heel of the hand, how to ride the bolt forward with their thumb just so, without getting it crushed, how to strip the rifle down to its major components, clean the gas cylinder, check the op rod, and reassemble it blindfolded. And always they heard that same sequence. Bang, 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 bang. Ping. Bolt locked open. Reload. In those days, the ping was a training soundtrack. Nothing more. Something the range instructor heard 100 times a day without really noticing. But as tensions in Europe and Asia worsened, the M1's significance grew. For all the arguments over details, the US had done something decisive. It had chosen a semi-automatic rifle for its infantry at a time when most of the world still clung to bolts. No one knew exactly how that would play out in a real war. They were about to find out. When American troops waded ashore in North Africa during Operation Torch, many of them carried M1 Garands slung across their backs. The first firefights against Vichy French forces and then later Axis troops were messy and confusing. But a pattern emerged in after-action reports and the quiet comments of officers. When American riflemen opened up, the volume of fire was startling. A squad of GIs with M1s could put out a fast rolling wall of accurate shots that made bolt-action opposition feel sluggish by comparison. Instead of a sharp crack, pause, there was a steady, hammering rhythm. Garands went to work in street skirmishes in North African towns and in rocky desert engagements. When French or German troops tried to peek from cover, they were met not with a single shot, but with multiple rounds in quick succession. The rifle, and by extension the clip, was earning its place. As for the ping, most of the early North African accounts don't dwell on it. In the wide open spaces of desert and scrub, with trucks, tanks, machine guns, and artillery making constant noise, the ping was drowned in the roar. If anyone worried that the enemy would hear it, the practical reality of battle quickly shoved that fear aside. "You'll be lucky to hear your own heartbeat out here," one GI wrote home, much less a piece of metal hitting the dirt. Italy was a different story. Gone were the long lines of sight and open desert. Now the riflemen had to fight up steep hills, through narrow valleys, and into old stone villages that had been turned into fortified nests. The M1 adapted well. On an Italian hillside, a squad of GIs took cover behind a stone terrace wall. Above them, a German machine gun chattered from a farmhouse window. The squad leader shouted orders over the rattle of bullets. 2 men laying down fire, others maneuvering, everyone using their M1s like miniature semi-automatic support weapons. Here, the Garand's ability to deliver a fast, accurate volume of fire was crucial, while the BR, Browning automatic rifle, provided sustained automatic fire. The rank-and-file riflemen could join in with their own rapid shots, squeezing off 2 or 3 rounds in the time it might take an enemy to work a bolt. In these tight, echoing hills, the ping was technically more audible. Sound bounced off stone and hillside. In a brief lull, a man might hear his own empty clip ring against the floor of a foxhole or clatter down a terrace. But combat rarely offered such quiet. When the machine gun was still firing, when mortars thumped in the distance, when boots scraped on rock and men shouted in English and German, the ping was, again, just a small piece of a huge soundscape. Still, the idea of the ping persisted. It worked its way deeper into GI folklore. New replacements, freshly arrived from stateside training, whispered about it after dark. "That's when they'll get you," someone would say, tracing the lip of a helmet with a finger. Soon as they hear that little bell chime, the veterans tended to snort and roll their eyes. "If you hear a ping," one said, "you've got bigger issues, like why you're still up when you're out of ammo." In the Pacific, the M1's timeline took a parallel path. Marines and soldiers carried the Garand through dense jungles, across black sand beaches, and into networks of caves and bunkers. The rifle's power and reliability were praised in these brutal, close-range fights. At a distance of 50 yards or less, common in jungle skirmishes, a semi-automatic rifle could be the difference between living and dying. A Marine could snap off multiple shots at fleeting figures in the underbrush without shifting his firing grip to work a bolt. But the psychological environment was different here. In the deep dark of a jungle night, far from artillery and the greater roar of mechanized war, every sound seemed louder: the crash of a branch, the rustle of a footstep, the distant murmur of voices, and in that quieter, more intimate hell, the ping rumor found especially fertile ground. Men on perimeter watch whispered about Japanese soldiers lying in wait, counting shots, listening for the high metallic ring of an empty clip. They passed around stories, usually third-hand, of nights when a ping supposedly triggered a sudden enemy rush. Whether those stories were true, misremembered, or outright inventions hardly mattered. Fear made them feel real. A Marine on watch might instinctively flinch at the ping, ducking a little lower, heart pounding harder, even if there was no one close enough to hear it but him. The rifle's mechanism hadn't changed. The battlefield psychology had. By D-Day in 1944, the M1 Garand had become the signature sound of American infantry in Europe. On the beaches of Normandy, men coming ashore clutched their Garands above the waves, then slogged through surf and sand to get within range of German positions. As they reached the seawall and beyond, the rifle's 8-shot bursts, punctuated by pings, joined the thunder of naval guns and machine guns. In the hedgerows of Normandy, squads used their firepower to punch through close, claustrophobic combat. GIs shot at muzzle flashes through leafy walls, their semi-automatic rifles giving them the ability to send several rounds into a suspected position without shifting their firing stance. The legend of the ping lingered in the background, but by now battle-hardened troops mostly treated it with a kind of weary humor. "You hear it, you duck, you reload," one vet later said. "If a German heard it and didn't already know where you were from all the shooting, I'd be impressed." Then came the Hurtgen Forest and the Battle of the Bulge, frozen hellscapes of snow, trees, and sudden ambushes. In those battles, what mattered most was that the M1 kept working in the cold, that its gas system didn't seize up, that its clips could still be jammed into the receiver by numb, gloved hands. The ping was still there, still part of the rifle's song, but survival hinged on training, tactics, and luck far more than on the sound of a little piece of ejected metal. World War II ended, but the M1 Garand was not done. When war broke out in Korea in 1950, American and Allied troops once again slung Garands over their shoulders and trudged into another set of hills, valleys, and frozen battlefields. Many Korean War veterans described the rifle in much the same way their World War II counterparts did: heavy but reliable, powerful, and reassuringly familiar. The semi-automatic action remained a huge advantage in close engagements. And yes, the ping was still there. By this time, though, it had acquired a kind of nostalgia. For many older soldiers, it was the sound of an entire era of war, a sound they had grown up with, survived with, a sound that, for better or worse, meant M1. In the years that followed, newer rifles began to replace the Garand. Detachable magazines and intermediate cartridges took over, but the M1 did not vanish. It moved into reserve units, Allied armies, and eventually civilian hands. On civilian ranges, with no one shooting back and no one listening for signals in the dark, the ping took on an entirely new character. It became beloved. Collectors and marksmen smiled when they heard it. For them, the M1's timeline had moved from necessity to history. The ping was now the closing note of a story, not a source of anxiety. From Springfield Armory in the 1930s to the foxholes of the 1940s and the frozen hills of Korea, the M1 Garand's ping traveled with the rifle through its entire life cycle, feared by some, mocked by others, remembered by all who carried it. What never changed was the mechanical reality behind that sound. A rifle had fired its 8. A clip had flown free, and somewhere a soldier's hands were already reaching for the next one. For a lot of GIs, the ping started as a ghost story. It became something else the first time they heard it in a real fight and didn't die. Picture a platoon somewhere in Italy, 1943. They've spent weeks whispering about the Garand's betrayal sound, how the last shot is followed by that tiny metallic ring, like a bell announcing that the man behind the rifle is empty. In camp, the stories are vivid. In the dark, they grow teeth. Then comes the day the platoon has to storm a hill. German troops are dug in behind rocks and low walls. Machine guns cover the approach. Mortars cough from somewhere up the slope. The air fills with dust, shouted orders, and the flat, harsh cracks of rifles. The M1s are firing as fast as the men can aim. One GI, let's call him Daniels, presses his shoulder into a dirt bank, sights on a muzzle flash in a rock slit, and squeezes the trigger again and again. He's not counting shots. Nobody counts shots in a fight like this. He's aiming, firing, shifting a few inches, firing again. Then, bang, 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 ping. The cliffside in front of him doesn't suddenly explode with Germans charging his position. No one magically pinpoints his location from 8 shots and a little bit of ringing steel. He doesn't become the victim of some clever enemy trick. What does happen is this. Daniels feels his rifle lock open. He hears the ping and reacts the way training has drilled into him. He drops his head a little lower, thumb finds a fresh clip, and he slams it into the receiver. The bolt jumps forward, there's a live round in the chamber again, and he's back on the sight line in barely a second. Behind him, the BAR gunner hasn't stopped shooting. Up the slope, another squad is firing too. The German position is busy trying not to be killed by all that. Daniels lives. That night, lying in a shallow scrape under his blanket, he remembers hearing his own ping, and realizing nothing special happened. The fear doesn't vanish all at once, but a crack appears in the myth. In the Hurtgen or the Ardennes, you could hear a lot of things in a foxhole at night: the creak of wet trees, the shuffle of boots, distant artillery, your own heart. You also heard your buddy's rifle. There's a small, important moment that played out in 1,000 variations. Two men sharing a hole or a trench lip. One is firing, the other is waiting for a target. The one who's firing runs through his clip. Ping! He ducks down to reload. Right then, the guy next to him stands up and keeps firing. The empty shooter realizes something. That sound is mostly a message to him, not to the Germans 50 yards away, who are already under fire, already hearing a dozen rifles and machine guns, already dealing with explosions and the whip crack of rounds past their ears. To him, his rifle has announced in the clearest possible way that it's time for his part in the rhythm. I've shot my 8. Get another clip. Don't freeze. Once you've lived through that cycle a few times in real combat, the ping stops being only a symbol of vulnerability. It becomes a cue, a metronome tick in the chaos. You still might curse it. You still might wish the gun would somehow reload itself on the last shot without saying a word, but you can't deny the truth. While the myth imagines the ping helping the enemy, in practice it mostly helps you. The original fear behind the ping myth comes from a solo image. One man, one rifle, one enemy. But that's not how US infantry was trained to fight. A typical rifle squad had multiple Garands, a Bear, sometimes a submachine gun or two. Soldiers were drilled in fire and maneuver tactics, taught to keep some weapons firing while others moved or reloaded. No commander wanted every rifleman blazing through all 8 rounds at once like they were in a movie. In real life, reloads are staggered, naturally. Some guys fire slower, picking careful shots. Some hold back a round or two in case of a sudden rush. Some are moving while others are shooting. As a result, the idea that a ping means everyone's empty just doesn't match what's happening on the ground. Even if a German soldier could pick out a single ping in the chaos and think, that one man over there is empty now, what does he do with that information? Rush across open ground while the rest of the squad is still armed and firing? Stand up from cover in the hope that the one guy who's reloading controls every threat in his sector? The more combat experience a unit gained, the more absurd the ping legend seemed when compared to actual firefights. Veterans started using it as a kind of test. If a replacement was still obsessing over the ping after a few battles, it usually meant he was still fighting the war in his head more than in front of his eyes. That doesn't mean the fear was completely irrational. There were moments, especially in the Pacific or in tight European villages, where fights dropped down to very close range and the noise level dipped for a heartbeat. In a shattered house in Italy, 2 GIs and a German soldier might be within 20 yards of each other, trading pot shots through doorways and broken windows. In a jungle ravine at night, a Marine on the perimeter might fire only a couple of rounds before holding his breath and listening for movement. In those tight, suspenseful spaces, every tiny sound felt magnified. Here, the ping myth had its strongest emotional grip. Men could imagine clearly. He hears that ring, he knows I'm empty, he charges. Sometimes that kind of scene probably played out. It's not impossible. War is the kingdom of weird 1 in 1,000 chances. But what mattered in the big picture wasn't whether the ping ever cost someone an advantage. It was how often it mattered compared to everything else, and how much more often the rifle's strengths outweighed its quirks. Even in those close fights, the M1's semi-automatic fire had likely already bought its owner a better chance of surviving the first exchange. The ping came after he'd just thrown 8 rounds downrange faster than most of his enemies could. The rifle had already bent the odds in his favor. For a lot of GIs, there was a specific turning point where their relationship with the ping changed. It wasn't dramatic. There was no single battle where the entire army decided in unison, "All right, we love the sound now." It was usually quieter. It was the 20th firefight instead of the first. It was the night they realized they hadn't thought about the ping at all. It was the moment they instinctively reloaded at that sound without a single spike of panic. Some even began to think of it as part of the rifle's language. Bang means you're in it. Ping means you're in between. The heavy clack of the bolt going forward means you're back. Under fatigue and stress, those simple sensory cues mattered. They cut through fogged brains and shaking hands. A few soldiers and Marines later described it almost fondly, the Garand talking to them, telling them, "Feed me." Later, when historians and gun enthusiasts dug into the question with cooler heads, they came to a fairly simple conclusion. In training or at a quiet range, the ping is obvious. In real combat, surrounded by noise and confusion, it's rarely distinct beyond a few yards. The M1's advantages, semi-automatic fire, powerful cartridge, fast reloads, massively outweigh any theoretical disadvantage of that tiny sound. But the real turning point wasn't in the archives. It was in the heads of thousands of young men who carried the rifle. They started by cursing the ping. They imagined it as a death sentence. Then slowly, battle by battle, they discovered something more grounded. If you were still alive to hear it, that meant you'd made it through 8 shots. And the enemy? If he noticed anything at all, it was probably the fact that you just put 8 rounds in his direction faster than he could. The ping did not vanish from GI complaints. They still joked about it, still told stories that made it sound like the herald of doom. But for many who survived the war, when they looked back, that sound had changed meaning. It was no longer just the moment you were empty. It was the moment a well-designed rifle told you, clearly and consistently, "Time to reload. Let's keep going." Maps and manuals can tell you what the M1 Garand was. The men who carried it tell you what it felt like. These are their kinds of stories, composite scenes drawn from memoirs, interviews, and the rhythms that repeat across different campaigns. The details change. The rifle doesn't. For most GIs, the first battle with the M1 wasn't against the enemy. It was against the drill sergeant. Fort Benning, Camp Roberts, Camp Wheeler, names that would blur together later into one long memory of dust, sweat, and shouting. A line of recruits stands on a firing line, boots in the dirt, helmets slightly crooked, rifles clutched with stiff, unpracticed hands. The air smells like hot metal and gunpowder. The range tower looms behind them like a watchful god. Load. Thumbs and palms fumble with the in-block clips. 8 rounds gleam in the sun. More than one recruit is hesitating, afraid of the horror story they've already heard. M1 thumb. If you do it wrong, the bolt slams shut on your thumb as you're loading and turns it into a purple balloon. The sergeants love demonstrating how not to do it, usually by grabbing some poor guy's hand and ramming it around dramatically. "Don't baby it!" one sergeant bellows now. "Garand's like a woman. You treat her nervous, she'll hurt you. Firm push. Heel of your hand, right down on that clip. Then get your damn thumb out of there." The line moves in sync, or tries to. Metal clicks. Some bolts snap forward in premature slams. A couple of guys curse and shake bruised fingers. Then the range goes quiet in that particular way it does when a lot of people are holding their breath. Fire! The world shrinks to front sight, rear sight, target. Bang! The first shot shocks some of them. The rifle kicks harder than the old 22s back home. The gas system whips the bolt back and forth so fast they hardly see it move. They recover, settle back into position. Bang, bang, bang. The line becomes a staggered drum roll. Some recruits rush, others hesitate. A few shots go over the berm. A sergeant barks corrective insults with almost artistic creativity. Then, one by one, the rifles start doing the thing that will define their sound for the rest of the war. Ping, ping, ping. All along the line, spent clips arc into the air and clatter onto concrete or dirt. Some bounce off helmets. A few hit boots. Recruits flinch the first few times. You can see it in the way they blink, in the quick, startled glances they give their own rifles, as if the weapon has just spoken out of turn. "Don't stare at it, genius," the sergeant roars at one kid who's gawking down at his action. "Rifle's empty. What do you do when the rifle's empty?" The recruit knows the answer, but his brain has blanked. The sergeant strides over, snatches the rifle, yanks another clip from the kid's belt, and demonstrates. Smooth, quick, practiced. "Ping means reload," he says, shoving the rifle back into the kid's hands. "Not stand there and write a letter home to your mom about it." By the end of basic, most of them move with the rifle like it's part of their bodies. They load without thinking, shoot without counting, and hear the ping as a command. You're done with those 8. Don't waste the pause. Feed me again. They still groan about M1 thumb. They still grumble about the weight, 10 pounds of steel and wood that they'll carry up hills and through mud. But in a few short weeks, they've learned the rifle's language, and whether they know it yet or not, that language will be with them on every battlefield they walk onto. The first time Private Joe Ramirez really understood what fire superiority meant, he was lying in a ditch outside a dusty North African village, wondering why the ground wouldn't stop shaking. The air was a smear of dust and smoke. Buildings ahead of him had their walls blown open, interiors exposed like dollhouses smashed with a hammer. Somewhere in there, a German machine gun was talking in harsh, stuttering bursts, cutting the air over the American line. Ramirez hugged his M1 close and listened to his squad leader shout over the noise. "On my mark! We lay down fire. Second squad flanks left. Keep those heads down." He peered over the lip of the ditch. He could see the muzzle flash in a second-story window, small flickers in the shadow. His heart hammered. This was not the tidy, controlled range back in the States. This was chaos. The sound was everywhere at once. In position. In position. Okay, go! Ramirez rose and planted the stock in his shoulder. He squeezed the trigger. Bang! The recoil punched straight back into him, familiar and somehow comforting. He didn't have to shift his grip, didn't have to reach for a bolt. His finger reset. Bang, bang, bang. The squad around him joined in. 10, 15 M1s barked together, each man firing as fast as he could reasonably aim. The noise was like tearing cloth made of thunder. The German guns stuttered, faltered, then went quiet as its crew ducked away from the sudden storm of incoming fire and shrapnel. In that sliver of time, second squad scrambled forward, moving between walls and rubble. Ramirez kept shooting until, ping! For a moment, out of everything else happening, he heard that. He didn't know if anyone else did. It felt like the sound had been delivered right into his own ears. His rifle locked back, mouth open. He ducked, fingers moving almost by themselves. Clip out of pouch, metal into metal, slam, clack, a fresh round in the chamber. He came back up and kept firing. Later, when the village was taken and the adrenaline had faded, Ramirez sat with his back against a wall, helmet tilted back, rifle across his knees. "How many did you get?" Another GI asked. "Don't know," Ramirez said. "Didn't see anyone drop, just saw that window and kept shooting." "You hear your ping?" Ramirez thought about it. "Yeah, kind of. In the middle. It was dead loud. Inside my head." His buddy snorted. "Long as nobody outside your skull heard it, who cares?" he said, lighting a cigarette. "Rifle talks to you, you listen. That's the deal." Months later, on a terraced hillside in Italy, the war narrowed down to one house. Sergeant Earl Tucker's squad had been pinned for nearly an hour by a German machine gun in the upper floor of a stone farmhouse. Every time someone tried to move out of cover, a storm of bullets chewed the ground around them. The company commander shouted for artillery, but the guns were busy elsewhere. They'd have to solve this the old-fashioned way. "Garand's and bar," Tucker growled, wiping sweat and grime from his eyes. "We're gonna smother that window. When they're down, I want Johnson and Harris moving to that low wall. From there, they lob grenades. Got it?" Nods all around. Throats swallowed. Tucker raised his M1. The farmhouse window sat in his sight picture like an accusation. He knew the machine gun team was in there. 2 or 3 men, scared and angry, just like him. "On me," he said quietly. "Fast and mean." He popped up and opened fire. Bang, bang, bang. The bar beside him joined in with a deeper, more continuous roar. Other M1s along the wall added their voices. The air between them and the house filled with stone dust and bits of shattered shutter. Inside the farmhouse, the German gunners flinched. They were used to outranging bolt-action rifles, to popping up, firing a burst, and ducking. Now, every time they tried to show themselves, 3 or 4 rounds smacked the stone around the window in the space of a second. Tucker fired until ping. There it was, but he barely registered it beyond a familiar cue. He dropped, jammed in a new clip, and leaned back up without losing the cadence of the attack. By the time his second clip was half gone, Johnson and Harris were at the low wall, much closer to the house, covered by that wall of semi-automatic fire. A grenade arced up, then another. The explosions blew in the window frame, turning the machine gun nest into a cloud of debris and screams. Afterward, Tucker sat on a broken wall, smoking, the rifle resting across his thighs. His hands were shaking slightly from the adrenaline. He watched the farmhouse smolder. "Sergeant," one of his men said, "you still worried about the ping getting you killed?" Tucker exhaled and watched the smoke curl. "Not if we're the ones doing all the talking," he said, patting the M1's stock. "They're too busy trying not to die to listen for music." On a Pacific island, the war was closer and quieter, private first class. Alan Red McCarthy lay in a shallow foxhole, sweat trickling down his spine despite the late hour. The jungle hummed with insects and distant surf. The smell was a mix of rotting vegetation and cordite. Somewhere out there in the trees, Japanese troops were also awake. His M1 rested across the lip of the hole, muzzle just clearing the earth. Every leaf, every shadow looked like it might move. Every creak of a branch sounded like a footstep. He had 7 rounds left in his clip. He knew that because he'd counted them this time. On night watch, men did count. It gave them the illusion of control. He'd heard stories, too many, about Japanese soldiers listening for the ping, waiting until a Marine emptied his rifle, then rushing the position with a bayonet and a yell. McCarthy's sergeant called most of those stories foxhole fairy tales. But the sergeant wasn't here right now. McCarthy was. A twig snapped somewhere ahead. He froze. Slowly, carefully, he eased the rifle to his shoulder. His cheek settled against the stock. The ghostly line of the sights floated over a patch of darkness that might have been a tree trunk, or something else. A shape moved. Closer this time. He didn't hesitate. Bang! Bang! The jungle exploded with sound as other Marines along the line fired too. Tracer rounds stitched out, briefly drawing green and red lines in the dark. Voices shouted. Someone screamed in Japanese, high and sharp. Then, just as quickly, the night swallowed the noise again, leaving ringing silence behind. McCarthy's heart thudded against his ribs. His ears roared. He realized he'd fired 3 shots. He forced himself to breathe slowly. He looked down at his rifle. 5 left. He pictured the ping in his head, imagined it ringing out like a dinner bell in the trees, enemies perked up and smiling. He could, if he wanted, eject the clip early. Catch it before it pinged. Top off with a fresh one. Some guys did that at night, but every part of his training argued against wasting ammo. Every part of his rational mind knew that if anyone was watching, they already knew approximately where he was. From muzzle flash, from noise, from the sheer fact that there was a line of Marines here. He swallowed, shifted his grip, and stayed where he was. He let the clip sit in the rifle's belly a little longer. When dawn came, they'd find a body or 2 out there. Maybe the men who'd tried to crawl closer in the dark. McCarthy would never know if those men had heard anything in the night besides thunder and shouting. But years later, when he told the story, he'd mentioned the ping myth with a small, embarrassed smile. "We believed all kinds of things out there," he'd say. "But I'll tell you this, I was a lot more afraid of not having a rifle like the Garand than I was of any little sound it made." In the Ardennes in December 1944, Sergeant Henry Cole was so cold he felt hollow. Snow crusted the edges of his foxhole. His fingers were cracked and numb even inside his gloves. The forest around him was a maze of trunks and drifts. Somewhere in that maze, German troops were moving. Panzer Grenadiers, maybe SS, maybe just as frozen and scared as he was. What he knew for certain was this: his squad was badly understrength, and they were in the path of an offensive nobody had quite expected. Cole's M1 Garand was one of the few solid anchors he had left. It had ridden through Normandy with him, through hedgerow hell and into the dark of the Hurtgen. Now it sat in his lap, bolt slightly eased closed to keep snow out of the chamber, clip pouch tight on his belt. He'd complained about the rifle hundreds of times, about its weight, about the way cleaning it in the field was a misery, about how the gas system didn't always love mud or ice. But deep down, he trusted it. When the Germans came, they came suddenly. Shouts in accented English, then in German, followed by gunfire that lit the trees. Cole snapped the bolt fully shut, shouldered the rifle, and joined the answering roar. He fired until the front sight danced, until his breath came in ragged white puffs. He shot until, ping! Even in the cold, even with artillery booming somewhere behind him, he heard it. But by now, the sound might as well have been the ring of a hammer on an anvil in a factory back home. Work done. Next piece. He slammed in a new clip so fast his fingers barely felt the metal. The bolt leapt forward. He was firing again before the Germans could cover the last ground between trees. The fight seesawed for what felt like hours and was probably minutes. When it was over, the snow in front of the American line was trampled and stained. German bodies lay awkward and still among the drifts. Cole sat back, chest heaving, rifle across his knees. Steam rose faintly from the barrel. Later, when someone asked him what he thought of the ping myth, he shrugged. Ping, he said. You hear a lot of things. You hear branches break, guys yell, rounds crack past your head. If some kraut picked out my ping and all that and decided that was the time to stand up, well, that was his mistake. He patted the Garand stock almost gently. This thing did right by me, he added. That's the part I remember. For thousands of men, battles like these defined the M1 Garand. They remembered the weight on long marches, the kick in their shoulder, the smell of hot oil and powder. They remembered M1 thumb and fouled gas systems. They remembered the ping, sometimes with fear, sometimes with a wry grin, but most of all, they remembered that when they needed it to speak, the rifle spoke loudly, quickly, and often enough to keep them alive. A rifle is more than steel and wood. To the man who carries it, it's a companion, a burden, and sometimes the only thing between him and death. The M1 Garand dug itself into the minds of American GIs in a way few weapons ever do. And the ping, small as it was, lived rent-free in that mental space. In letters home and in interviews decades later, GIs often talked about their Garands like a person. They named them, they cursed them, they bragged about them. This old girl's been with me since North Africa, a veteran might say, patting the stock in a grainy 1980s interview. She never let me down. The weight that had once been a source of complaint, 10 pounds of rifle plus ammo, became part of that identity. You earned the right to complain about it. You earned the right to be proud of mastering it. Within that relationship, the ping became one of the rifle's quirks. Like a friend who always cleared his throat before speaking, the Garand had its own little signature. Some men hated that quirk. Some barely noticed. Some grew oddly fond of it. But nobody forgot it. Fear in war often pools in the quiet moments, the night before an attack, the half hour before dawn, the long watch in a foxhole when nothing moves. That's when minds wander. That's when myths sink in. A lot of GIs first heard about the ping's supposed danger in exactly those moments. Someone passing along a story about a guy who fired his last round, heard the ping, and was instantly rushed by the enemy. Maybe it happened, maybe it didn't. In the telling, it always sounded terrifying. When you're 19, far from home, and already half convinced you might not see your next birthday, your brain is more than happy to believe that a tiny sound could decide your fate. So the ping became a vessel for a larger, more complicated fear. I will run out of control. I will run out of options. My rifle will be empty when I need it most. The sound at the end of the clip was a neat, tidy symbol for that anxiety. It gave shape to something much bigger, the dread every soldier carries that at some point he'll be caught dry at the worst possible time. It was easier to talk about the ping than to say, I'm afraid I'll be helpless. But fear doesn't get the last word. Combat has a brutal way of grinding away at illusions. After enough firefights, the ping shifted for many GIs from a looming threat to just part of the background. You can hear this change in their later stories. Men who survived long tours rarely dwell on the ping. They talk about artillery. They talk about snipers. They talk about being shelled or ambushed or frozen. The ping, if they mention it at all, is usually a footnote, something they laughed about more than anything. Why? Because in actual combat, the brain learns to filter. It homes in on the most immediate survival cues, movement, flashes, the direction a bullet just came from. The tiny metallic noise at the end of your own firing string gets demoted from possible disaster to reload reminder. Just like the slam of the bolt becomes part of the gun's heartbeat, the ping becomes a punctuation mark your ears barely register consciously. In the end, the ping myth reveals a tension at the core of every soldier's mind. On one side, superstition, stories, rumors, and half-believed warnings that grow in the cracks left by uncertainty. On the other, trust, earned day by day, fight by fight, in a weapon that keeps working. The M1 Garand gave GIs plenty of reasons to trust it. It hit hard, it shot fast, it usually kept going in rain, mud, heat, and cold if you treated it right. Every time a GI emptied a clip, heard that ping, slammed in a new one, and lived to tell the tale, the superstition lost a little ground. It never completely disappeared. Myths rarely do. But for many veterans, when they looked back, the emotional weight of the ping had shifted. In their memories, it was less the moment of exposure, and more the breath between bursts of power. A small sound, between 8 shots past and 8 shots yet to come. From a distance, from that God's eye view of arrows on maps and tables of equipment, the M1 Garand didn't just give off a little ping, it changed what American infantry could do. Before the M1, the basic infantryman carried a bolt-action rifle. Accurate, reliable, but limited by human hands. Every shot came with a built-in pause. Work the bolt, reacquire the sight picture, fire again. In a world of machine guns and mortars, that pause was starting to feel dangerously old-fashioned. The M1 broke that rhythm. With Garands in their hands, American rifle squads suddenly had something most of their enemies didn't. A line of men who could put out rapid, aimed fire without sacrificing control. 8 rounds, each just a trigger pull away, no mechanical gymnastics in between. That mattered in dozens of small practical ways. A squad could suppress a machine gun nest more effectively, making it duck and stay ducked. A patrol walking into an ambush could throw far more fire back in those critical first seconds. A defensive line could respond to probing attacks with a volume of fire that felt to the enemy, like more men than were actually there. The en-bloc clip system, so often criticized in hindsight, was part of that effectiveness. It was rugged, cheap, and fast. A trained GI could reload in about a second, often less, and be right back in the fight. Mechanically, the ping was just the audible sign that all of that was working. The rifle had cycled 8 times without a hitch. The magazine was empty. The bolt had locked itself open, inviting a new clip. If there had been some way to magically reload without any sound at all, the basic equation of the battlefield wouldn't have changed much. The real advantage came before the ping, in those 8 semi-automatic shots that arrived faster than most Axis riflemen could answer. That's why when generals and historians looked back on the war, they didn't obsess over the clip. They talked about the firepower. General George Patton called the M1 the greatest battle implement ever devised. That wasn't because it was quiet. It was because American infantry, from Tunisia to Tokyo Bay, had a rifle that let them hit hard, often and accurately. In that light, the ping wasn't a crippling flaw. It was a footnote. A tiny, sharp sound at the end of a burst of power that helped U.S. squads punch above their weight, turning groups of tired, scared young men into something the enemy had to respect, a line of rifles that could talk back fast. When the guns finally fell silent and the soldiers went home, the M1 Garand followed them, if not in their duffel bags, then in their memories. In the decades after World War II and Korea, the rifle became something more than equipment. It became a symbol. You saw it in newsreels, stacked in pyramids on parade grounds. You saw it in black and white photos of Normandy, Iwo Jima, the Chosin Reservoir. A squared-jawed GI with an M1 over his shoulder became the poster image of the American fighting man. And the ping? That little sound slipped out of the foxholes and into the stories. Authors mentioned it in memoirs, sometimes as a nervous joke, sometimes as a vivid detail that brought a battle scene to life. Filmmakers and later video game designers seized on it. It was cinematic, distinct, easy to recognize. One sharp note that told the audience, the clip is empty, the moment is dangerous. On screen, the myth hardened. Directors loved the drama of a lonely GI, His rifle pinging, the enemy suddenly knowing he's empty. It made sense in a script, in the tight frame of a shot. It was simple, clear, scary. Reality had been murkier. But stories prefer clean edges. At the same time, veterans' voices kept whispering a more nuanced truth. In interviews and shooters clubs, at VFW halls and living room gatherings, old men with careful hands would strip and reassemble invisible rifles as they talked. "The ping?" they'd say. "Yeah, you heard it. Sometimes you worried about it. Mostly you were just glad that damned thing worked." Some of them bought surplus Garands when they hit the civilian market. Others encountered the rifle again at military funerals or honor guards, where its silhouette marched on in ceremony long after it left frontline service. On modern rifle ranges, the atmosphere is different. No one is shooting back. Nobody's listening from the tree line with a bayonet. A shooter lines up on a paper target, fires 8 rounds of .3006, and hears that same bright metallic note as the clip pops free. Ping. Down the line, heads turn, not in fear, but in recognition. For younger shooters raised on movies and games, it's the sound of legend. For the few remaining veterans, it's a doorway back to a past they can never fully leave behind. Maybe one of them, older now, lifts his head and smiles faintly. "We used to curse that sound," he says, "thought it was gonna get us killed." He runs a hand along the stock, remembering mud, snow, heat, and fear. "But truth is," he adds, "if you lived long enough to hear the ping, the rifle probably did right by you." The M1 Garand's ping began as a mechanical side effect. It ended as one of the most recognizable notes in the soundtrack of World War II. McCarthy's heart thudded against his ribs. His ears roared. He realized he'd fired 3 shots. He forced himself to breathe slowly. He looked down at his rifle. 5 left. He pictured the ping in his head, imagined it ringing out like a dinner bell in the trees, enemies perked up and smiling. He could, if he wanted, eject the clip early, catch it before it pinged, top off with a fresh one. Some guys did that at night, but every part of his training argued against wasting ammo. Every part of his rational mind knew that if anyone was watching, they already knew approximately where he was. From muzzle flash, from noise, from the sheer fact that there was a line of Marines here.